We will now hear from Root and Branch's very own Penelope Middelboe. Penelope, you've been introduced, you've been such a feature, so no further introduction, over to you.
I want to tell you about the Magisterium. Now, those of you who, like me, enjoy Philip Pullman's Dark Materials and Book of Dust will know all about the Magisterium. It's a dark and sinister kind of authority, a knot of grim-looking and conniving men in black who meet in lofty buildings and run the world with an iron fist. They're concerned only with their own power. In the Catholic Church, there is, of course, no such thing. But actually, there is such a thing in the Catholic Church as the Magisterium. I know because Sister Gemma Simmons introduced us to it in her talk during our year-long journey of discernment. Sister Gemma is a Cambridge academic, an ecclesiologist, a theologian, a sister of the Congregation of Jesus, so I trust her. Now, the first thing I want to say this evening at the end of a very long week, at the end of a very long year, is you, Root and Branches, as we've started to call ourselves, are a pilgrim people who've crossed the desert. Some of us may feel we're in exile, like James Carroll. We have left behind what James Allison called the strong belonging of ignorance and fear. You, Root and Branches, have done the hard work, completed your homework. We're dealing here not in claims, but facts, not protests, not half-truths, not even new ideas, certainly not heresies. The first thing for us as we go back to our parishes, as wonderful Richard Mackay told us, is that we can cast off our fear. There is nothing we've heard here that can take us away from Christ. We're in safe hands. Nothing we've heard is not biblical. This, my fellow Root and Branches, we now know is the new mainstream. Mary McAleese has called Root and Branch a miracle, showcasing what it feels like to be an equal citizen of the church, how to listen to each other, how to trust the voices of lay men and women open to guidance of the Spirit. She described it, Root and Branch, as the biggest reset in Christian history. But it is a reset. It's a call to rediscover all that's wonderful about the Catholic Church. As Newman put it in his hymn, Lead, Kindly Light, we are rediscovering those angel faces which we have loved long since and lost a while. The second thing is that it belongs to us. So what is it that belongs to us? Well, the Magisterium is. Now you see, Sister Gemma tells us a bit more about this. The Magisterium is the teaching authority of the church. Now, the 1950s people have tried to make us believe that there's a teaching church, the bishops and our parish priests, and a listening church, us, silently in the pew. But as Sister Gemma told us, the decrees of the Ecumenical Council make it perfectly clear the teaching authority of the church belongs to us all. Pope Francis's International Theological Commission of 2014 declared that, quotes, the whole church, laity and hierarchy alike, bears responsibility for and mediates in history the revelation which is contained in the scriptures and in the apostolic tradition. Well, you can't put it more clearly than that. This week, our panel on church authority showed us that historically, the church was a democratic organization. Luca Bedini, who's been here this weekend, points to the ancient precept of the church from the early Middle Ages, something that was regarded as essential to Catholicism until recently and was brought back by Pope Francis in 2015. And that is the quote, used to be in Latin, "What touches all should be discussed and agreed by all." Mary Macaleese made exactly the same point and added that anything else simply contravenes our human rights. This week also, our panel on liturgical ministry, chaired by Catherine over there, told us that, without any doubt at all, it is biblical and Catholic teaching that all ministries should belong to all. Not should, actually, do belong to all. Our panel on moral authority called not for tomes of regulations, but teaching on ways of thinking. We want a prophetic, democratically governed church that can read the signs of the times and help us to interpret them in our own complex lives. What strikes me very strongly about the organisation of Root and Branch leading up to this weekend has been the enthusiasm and commitment of the various young people who've worked for us. Some of them are children, but others cousins and people we know and other friends who we found pulled in. They've all been full of thoughtfulness and love, and most especially a passion for justice, which is why they wanted to help us. And they're almost all atheists. These are the people the traditionalist church has let down. It's turned its back on them. But we don't need to do this any longer. We can be the loving, creative church our young people want. And we can start right now. So that's why we call this thing, casting out fear. Don't be afraid. The church belongs to us all. Working out the best way to be the church is something that has always belonged to all the baptized faithful in every age and context. Whatever anybody tries to tell you, nobody can ever have the power to take that away from the people of God. And the third and final thing is to say that Root and Branch will not be silent. We welcome our brothers, the bishops' interest in our synod and in the Bristol text. They're listening. We hope and pray that, as Helena says, they will also hear us. And in all Christian love, we shall not let them try to discern it away. It is not theirs to discern. It remains to be seen whether, as the Bristol text affirms, we have to find a way to elect representative bodies, or whether the bishops will follow the church's teaching and simply welcome us, the faithful laity, into their discussions and decisions. If, sadly, our brothers, the bishops, find in the end they're too afraid to take it on, then we shall send it directly to the office of the Synod in Rome. We're already planning that. I think Pam's going to take it, aren't you, Pam? And if the office of the Synod will not listen, like they met Helena earlier, with that rather cold meeting that she had that was meant to be with the Pope, but when they got wind of it, the cardinals took over, then we shall shout the good news from the rooftops. Around the world, in the highways and byways, we shall simply set the people of God free to be the wonderful Catholic Church we have always been called to be. Free in what James Allison called, with his wonderful use of language, the strength of weak belonging. The strength of weak belonging. What Jesus was all about, showing his weakness. Not clinging together in ignorance and fear, but talking, don't all have to agree, and walking together with Christ in love. My daughter sent me a message before we started, and she's an atheist. Love is everything. Go and fight, Mum. Now, Mary Macaleese told us, and I was so thrilled to hear it, that only Root and Branch and the German synodal way are offering any sort of lay voice in the entire world of the Catholic Church. That's crazy. We just began this as a sort of, I was going to do half a day a week. What we're doing here today now truly matters. And thank you, Christina, for all your tips on how to take it forward. This is an historic moment, and I'm not saying that with hubris. The synodal genie, as Mary McAleese said, can't remember, there's so many speakers who've said such amazing things, is out of the bottle. The laity are inspired. It's our church. But first, we do have a responsibility to educate ourselves. We do not have to be told what to do and think, but we do need to put ourselves in a position where we can do and think for ourselves. I've had to learn an awful lot. I knew very, very little when I started last January. It's what Dermot and Merkur called, and I love this phrase, a re-education in faith from the ground up. Martha Heiser from Austria presented us with a wonderful vision. I think John and I are going to go there and camp in her garden or something, of ordinary people like us going about the business of being the church, blessing our children, blessing our bread, blessing our sick and dying, our harvest, our work, when we retire. I love this too, this literally what she said, blessing the many occasions in a woman's life that need a reinforcing ritual. I can begin to imagine many of those. You can, Martha said, begin to renew the church around you, praying, eating, discussing scripture together. Well, let's decide on our own pace, our own personal pace. Go slowly, but let's go. Go implement our own ministry. There's so much to do, and Jesus is waiting. God, said Martha, will like to hear us. And we've heard from our panel on sharing authority that this is where the church began, and that this is still how many other churches still function. In the small base communities Luca Bedini told us about in Argentina, and Virginia in India. Our faith, Virginia said, is best lived in our neighborhood, where we can live the Eucharist and share the Eucharist. And the great thing is that our experience so far is that many, many parish priests, like Richard and Tony Cassidy and Dermot and Tom, although he doesn't call himself a priest very often, would be thrilled to join us. Base communities is a bit of a, I'd never heard of it before, a bit of an academic-sounding name. So why don't we choose a better one? Meeting in this way could be what Dermot Merkur calls, in that phrase he told us from the translation from Jesus' own Aramaic, the companionship of empowerment. I think that's such a wonderful phrase, the companionship of empowerment. We do it together. As James Allison called it, walking into being alongside others, and not making all those others the same as us either. So we must just do it. We don't need anyone's permission. This is what reflects God's self-revelation to every one of us. It's surely a high calling. It's simple, and it's so difficult to be the church where we are right now. So we will share our Bristol text, proclaim it from the rooftops. We'll come together in small communities of companionship of empowerment to learn and pray and be Christ in our neighborhoods. And these things are just the first steps. Of that we can be sure. But where after that? God alone knows where he will take us. As John Henry Newman went on in that wonderful hymn, we do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for us. But the last word on this should go to a theologian, because this is what Root and Branch has been about educating ourselves, by calling on those who actually spend their lives thinking and living these issues. We can do the gut stuff, and that's really important. But it is also very important to have the people who can give us the theological backing. So I will hand you over, finally, and it's really worth it, because Tom is a very sought-after speaker, to Thomas, or Tom O'Loughlin, Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology at the University of Nottingham and the director of Studia Traditionis Theologiae. I'm not very good at my Latin, but I can tell you that root and branch is radice ramoque.
I've been told I have 20 minutes, and I will keep to it. First of all, I can't tell you how lovely it is to be actually in the same room and looking down at real faces. I last spoke to a group of human beings on the 12th of March, a year ago in Maynooth, and a university in Ireland. And I didn't think it would be 18 months before I would be able to actually be in the same room and be talking. So it's fantastic to be here. We are, so far as we know, the only animals who make myths. We are myth-making animals. That is far more important than the classical definition of Boethius, individua substantia rationalis naturae, an individual substance or a rational nature. We now know that chimpanzees and bonobos and many others of the great apes are tool-making animals, and tool-making animals demands rationality, demands the power of abstraction, and then the power of implementing a theory to produce a tool, even if it's just to smash a hazelnut. But we make myths. Now, what do we mean by a myth? I will give you a definition that has been used by biblical scholars for about a century and a half. A myth is a very complex story that is transparent, we see through it, to reality which is transfinite. In other words, the reality we know as human beings is more than the bits and pieces. We have a vision. That vision may include a supreme being, or it may be that we can save ourselves and build the perfect utopia here, or it may be that we will live forever. But every single human being builds a myth. And if we share that myth, it can be an ideology, but if we share that myth and it is greater than humanity, it is a religion. So, what I've been listening here very carefully over the last 30 hours, I've been listening to people who are aware that myth can open up. We heard people describing their new experiences, their new ministries. We heard the group talking about how they were going against the very act that occurred 20 years ago in New York in their discussions of religion. They're myths that are opening up. But we've also heard people referring back to myths that closed down. The myth that you need to have the parish priest to tell you whether you can have a hysterectomy. The horrors of a 7-year-old trotting out, I told lies, I said bad words, and I was disobedient. And you suddenly realize that God is a mixture of a policeman and an angry parent. So we live by myths that can close us in. Take the myth of Eve. The myth of Eve, she is the one who tempts man. She is the one who, as you said, it would be dreadful if the poor man said he'd fancy the vicar. As the letter attributed to Paul says in one of the pastoral epistles, remember, it wasn't Adam who was seduced. but Eve. So there is a myth that explains the relationship of man and woman in the church, and it's a very constricting myth. For instance, there's a brilliant myth that the demons are turned on by women's hair, and therefore hair must be covered. It's a myth that survives in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. It's the reason nuns wore veils until very recently, and some still do. So there's a myth, and it links, limits. But there are myths that can liberate. Take the myth of basic Christian communities. The myth of the basic Christian community is that we can form in our small group an image that can be a new way of living in society, a new way of relating to one another, and a new way even of relating to the universe and to the source of the universe. But there's one myth that has been hovering underneath so much that I've been listening to, and that I've heard in the past few weeks as people have been talking about this synod. And it came to a head for me just over a week ago. I was chatting to a priest on FaceTime. And he said, I see you're going to that thing in Bristol. Yes, I said, I've been asked to speak at it. And he said to me, it's really worthwhile. It's going to end in nothing, isn't it? It's going to end in tears. Who's going to take us seriously? Well, I said, we've got to reimagine the church, you know. Reimagining the church is part of our onward work as Christians. Yeah, he says, you can imagine. But let's get the facts right. Jesus founded the church and ordained the 12 apostles at the Last Supper, and he said that the powers of hell will not prevail against it, and he gave authority to Peter. You got to deal with the facts, Tom. You got to deal with the facts. Now, every single word that man said can be footnoted to one of the 4 canonical texts we refer to as the Gospels. So don't laugh too loudly. If that man wants to play the game Spot the Source, every single one of those terms has a footnote. Matthew this, Luke that, John the other. Now, I want to take just 4 of those statements and decode them. And I want to decode them as a historian about what we know about the historical Jesus. Which we really should say is how little we know about the historical Jesus. Now, this is the sort of thing that every theology class does in year 1. And you're introduced to form criticism and how little, and not to treat the Gospels as biographies, and not to start treating them as if they're every statement. And you're warned, don't refer to Christ as if it's a surname, refer to Jesus. Christ, you don't call someone by their job description. He is the Christ. You don't say, hello, plumber. You say, hello, Jack. Who is the plumber? It is Jesus who is the Christ. That is our confession of faith. If you just say he's Jesus of Nazareth, you don't need to confess him. But if you say Jesus is the Christ, that is a confession of faith. That's the move from history to myth. Jesus founded the church. Jesus didn't found the church, nor indeed could he found the church. He belonged to the church of Israel. Israel saw itself as a church. In the Greek translation of the scriptures, it already described itself as a church. That's why we took over the word church. That's why we don't use the word synagogue. We had a choice, but we opted for one rather than the other because it was more intelligible to Greek speakers. he couldn't have founded a church, he belonged to a church. So the question for us is, in terms of faith, what do we mean to say that we see the church as founded on Jesus? How do we see ourselves as founded on his message? Do you see the difference between history and myth? And he ordained 12 apostles. Well, let's just take that apart. There does seem to have been a system in Jesus' wandering through Galilee and on his trip down to Jerusalem, and the other trips, if we accept the Markan agenda, that he had a special group of followers whom he referred to as the 12, whom he saw as being a myth of the new Israel representing the 12 tribes. But by the time our stories were written down, 3 or 4 generations later, we had forgotten the names of the 12. And so we have, if we actually tabulate all the lists, we've got nearly 16. And we've spent a lot of time trying to amalgamate them back to 12. Apostles were messengers sent from one church to another. In fact, someone like Vincent Manning down there, he comes from his organization. He's an apostle from that organization to this group. And if he was going to organize something, Penelope would send someone from her organization to, that's the function of apostles. But by the time Luke wrote his gospel, the confusion between the 12 and the apostles was already they were making historical mistakes. Jesus ordained no one. In fact, there is no evidence that Jesus left any plan for the structure of his organization. So all the plans we have are myths that we produce to carry on the message of seeing ourselves as inspired by Jesus. So we mustn't see history as limiting us, but actually liberating us. And then the gates of hell shall not prevail against it for all time. All the evidence points that Jesus was one of those who thought that the world was going to end, but apparently what makes him different to people like John the Baptist is that whereas John the Baptist is thinking in terms of the great crunch, Jesus is thinking that it will end in a glorious banquet. His myth is that the end is the joyful love of God, rather than the punitive tax collector that John the Baptist was preaching. That's probably why they broke apart. Though 100 years later, it's important to try and amalgamate them again, and we see that happening in the synoptics. So the interesting thing is, the earliest followers of Jesus thought that they were getting ready for the end. And of course, we set a little undergraduate task, demonstrate how Paul moves in the early letters from a belief in an immediate eschaton to a more distant eschaton. But it's not an academic exercise in the genuine letters of Paul. Rather, it's an exercise in seeing how the whole Christian church had to move from having a vision that the end is quite literally only years away, within our lifetime, to it being further away. And then the problem was that for the first 2 generations of Christians, the great center of God's presence is still the temple in Jerusalem. Paul is still a devotee of the temple. It's one of the reasons we find it so difficult to interpret Paul, because we always forget he assumes that the temple in Jerusalem is still doing its job. It is the presence of God on earth. The problem is the Christians, the followers of Jesus, they're not yet called Christians, they have to reinvent themselves. Not just Paul, but all of them. Hey, the end is not coming. And then, in 70, comes the catastrophe. the greatest single shock for the followers of Jesus and for all of the people of Israel was that how do you cope when the temple ends? And that is the great separator between Christianity and the time of Jesus. All our canonical texts are post-70. They are all, everything in the universe shattered. Imagine if the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Patriarch of Constantinople were all abolished. How would you reconstruct Christianity? That's the sort of task that the followers of Jesus had to face after 70. And there's the breaking of the ways between those who saw all these newfangled ideas as what led to the catastrophe, and those who said, hey, maybe we have to rethink the whole thing minus the temple. We heard the art historian this morning saying the Gospels are 2nd century. Someone to me said, no, I don't think they're 2nd century. Hey, it doesn't matter whether there's 30 or 40 years between them. The important thing is no one would imagine that any of our Gospels were written before the temple was destroyed. It's irrelevant whether it was written in 95 or 125. I suspect that our four were all written and in circulation in some form by the 140s. We know that they're first operating as a group in the 180s, and there are still texts in the New Testament, such as pastorals and probably the Deutero letters of Paul, which are later again. But the interesting thing is, Christianity had to reimagine itself, and reimagine itself most profoundly. And then lastly, there is, well, he made Peter in charge. The first bishop of Rome to claim that he's the successor of Peter was Innocent I in a letter of about 410. So the question we have to face is, we can often have myths that are fundamentalist. They're saying, it's all facts, there's very little you can do, it's steady state, just onward moving, like that man I was speaking to last Sunday. In point of fact, Christianity has to constantly reimagine itself in terms of the memory of Jesus, which is a very complicated thing, in terms of what it means to witness to God, not just today, but tomorrow. So we have to see ourselves as not engaging in a super historical search. That's fundamentalism. It's all back there. That's best left to professional historians. The task of theology is to reimagine in a situation that has never existed before, in the same way that the Christians, as they discovered that the world was not ending, and then that the temple was going to be destroyed and had been destroyed, had to reimagine. So I want to leave you with the great myth that finishes the book of Deuteronomy. It's a myth that Christians have been using since before any of the texts of our New Testament, and Jews were using as their catechetical text for at least 200 years before the coming of Jesus. And it's the myth of the dying Moses presenting two visions, a way of life on the one hand and a way of death. And the way of death is very backward looking and very limited. But the way of life is to go into a new land and into a new situation and to think about not just life for you, but life for your children. So, as the synod ends, study more carefully, Christianity is a very complex myth. And the next time you're tempted to say, Christ said something, say, do I mean Jesus, or do I mean this is what one of the early writers reported Jesus is saying? Because it frees your mind to focus on what we should be focusing on, not on the past. Thank you.
Of course, before we go, don't go yet. Restrain yourselves. We also, yes, over to you, and then the farewells from Penelope and Sue.